to my fair share of Thunder games and have boarded a plane from California to Oklahoma City when there were tornado warnings. So I feel like I'm one of you guys. Just to talk a little bit about Forward's criminal justice reform work, we support reform in 4 states. Oklahoma is one of them, but also Mississippi, Arizona, and New York. And those are 4 states where either the incarceration rate is very high compared to the national average, or there is a large prison population. That's sort of the case in New York. And Forward's goals when it comes to criminal justice reform are fourfold. First, we are supportive of reforms that will help to safely reduce the prison population. But we also want to shrink the footprint of the criminal justice system in general and want to confront issues in communities in ways that don't involve incarceration and imprisonment. I think there are a lot of alternatives, as Stephanie was saying, to those kinds of really punitive policies and excessive sentences. Third, we strive to increase opportunities for people who have been entangled in the criminal justice system. And lastly, I want to spend a little bit of time on this. Forward is supportive of policies that help families who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. I've sort of, I think we all at Forward come to this issue with the lens of supporting families, and certainly through this work, I've come to understand a lot more that when one person is sentenced to prison, it's actually the whole family that serves that sentence too and suffers with that person. A few years back, Forward had partnered with researchers at Cornell University and University of Chicago to try and understand actually what the impact of incarceration is on families. And we conducted a first of its kind national survey to understand this issue. And the results that we found were like floored me. For those of you that are on this call, I just ask, like, if you were going to guess one out of how many adults in this country have had a family member incarcerated, just sort of think about that number in your head. And is it 1 in 1,000? Is it 1 in 100? Our survey actually found that it's 1 in 2. 1 in 2 adults, that's 113 million people in this country, have had a family member that's incarcerated. So if you think about what that means for Oklahoma's families and Oklahoma's children, for every person that's serving a sentence in prison right now, decades long, because we know Oklahoma has very long sentences for both violent and nonviolent crimes, but especially for nonviolent crimes. How many milestones are missed when that person goes behind bars? How many Christmases and birthdays and first days of school or family road trips? Those are all things that go away when a person is in prison for a long time. So, I think about this a lot. Like I was saying, I travel to Oklahoma a lot, and when I'm gone from my daughters for 2 days, it feels like forever. And so I think the thought of being separated from them is heartbreaking. And that's what's happening in Oklahoma every day with so many children and so many families. So just kind of want to, if there's interest, I'm happy to share that report. And just want to say I'm so excited to work with advocates like Speaker Steele and so many others in state on criminal justice reform. I think Oklahoma has made incredible strides over the past 5 years, including the passage of State Question 780 and 781. The legislature turned around and made that reform retroactive so that hundreds of families could be reunited. There are big problems, obviously, to tackle in the state, but I've really been so inspired by all of you and appreciate this opportunity to talk about how we can work on reform together this session.
Jasmine, would you want to go next since you and Shanna work together with Forward?
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Jasmine Sankofa. I am a policy and research manager at Forward. I second everything Shanna has mentioned. I'm a bit new to Forward, but previous to joining the Forward team, I worked on family separation looking at the criminal legal system and how families are separated in Oklahoma. So I am so excited to be here with you all today and continue this conversation.
Fantastic. And if Jasmine, is it okay for me to go, or are you going to do some slides? Okay. All right. So I'll just do a quick introduction and then we'll get into the meat of some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. My name is Kris Steele, and I am beyond honored to get to participate in this discussion tonight. I want to say thank you to Stephanie, to Jackie, to Jan, and really to the League of Women Voters for all that you do for Oklahoma. I think it is so important as a lifelong Oklahoman, as the dad of two incredible daughters, that we do everything that we can to intentionally address issues of gender inequality and do everything that we can to make sure that we have empowered, strong women and voices in our state. And so I just want to say thank you so much to the League of Women Voters. I want to say just a couple of things to connect to the dots as we get into the discussion. Shanna, I think, did a great job of underscoring the impact that this has in the number of individuals that this issue of mass incarceration affects in Oklahoma. But I just want to touch on the far-reaching effects of incarceration in our state. So just by way of introduction, unfortunately, Oklahoma struggles with a high adverse childhood experience score. It's called the ACE score. I know that everybody on this call is very familiar with that. One of the factors that would be considered an adverse childhood experience is having a parent who is incarcerated, and that separation and what that experience and that felony conviction does to that parent's ability to provide for their family even post-release is significant. That's one thing. The other thing I would mention is that Oklahoma also has the highest rate of grandparents raising grandchildren per capita of any state in the nation. And again, every study that's been conducted to try to make sense of what's driving the high rate of grandparents raising grandchildren in Oklahoma, this issue of mass incarceration is at the forefront. Very quickly, another issue is that Oklahoma is still currently under a federal decree, plan of improvement, as it pertains to our foster care system. In 2012, the federal government intervened and put us on an improvement plan. And they very clearly said, Oklahoma, you're not doing an adequate job of caring for the number of kiddos in your foster care system. Again, I just want to connect the dot that the number of kids in our foster care system is also directly related to this issue of mass incarceration. The final thing I would say, just by way of introduction, is that unfortunately Oklahoma historically has held the unfortunate distinction of having the highest female incarceration rate per capita of any state in the nation. And I just want to say very clearly, as a fella whose grandmother, great-grandmother, mom, wife, two daughters are from Oklahoma, the people in our state aren't worse than the people who live in Arkansas or Texas or Kansas or New Mexico or anywhere else in the United States. It's not that we have worse people, it's that we have worse sentencing guidelines and policies that trap a person within the criminal justice system. And so this conversation tonight, I think, could not be more timely for a host of reasons. And as we consider what we can do to incorporate data-driven solutions, evidence-based policies, and actually create a system that has proven to be successful in other states. Your voice, your efforts, your energy, your involvement in this discussion is paramount. And so again, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. I'm super excited to discuss the policies that are right in front of us, that are making their way through the legislative session, even as we speak. And I hope that together, collectively, we can join forces to make some improvements and to reverse the trends that we've seen for far too long in our state.
Thank you so much, Kris. And Jackie, I wanted to give you an opportunity too, and platform. Jackie is our amazing leader, and she's brought us all together and coordinated how tonight's going to go. And so I sure wanted to give you some time to say a few words. before we get right to the nitty gritty and the meat of Jasmine's wonderful slides. And
thank you, Stephanie. I'm not the leader. I'm just the office administrator. But thank you for calling me the leader. I am the office administrator for the state of Oklahoma for the League of Women Voters, and I'm the secretary for Oklahoma County. And I just find criminal justice reform very dear to my heart. Like Kris said, it's directly connected to the DHS system, the Child Protective Services system, the ACE scores, and just the way that all of it is connected. I feel like Oklahoma has a lot of great, great people. And that's what makes this state a good state, is because the people are so friendly, but our system is not so great. And there's a lot of room for change and opportunity there. So I'm happy to be here. I'm so grateful to be with Kris and Shanna and Jasmine, and we'll keep it going and hopefully educate a lot of Oklahomans on how to track these bills and get our legislature to push them.
thank you, Jackie. I maybe by way of segueing into Jasmine's slides, when Shanna and I had spoken about exactly what you're talking about, Jackie, the thing that she said that I thought was so beautiful, she said, we have big problems. These are big problems that we're talking about tonight. But then she went on to say, and I think she mentioned it in her introduction, Oklahomans have big hearts. And so these big hearts and these, so it's so beautiful, this idea that yes, they're big problems. Yes, we have big hearts. Yes, we're going to work these out together. And so thank you, Jasmine's wonderful dad and all the good stuff that you've brought along with us to show us tonight then.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody, for setting that table. I am going to attempt to share my screen. All right. Awesome. So Kris and Shanna, feel free to jump in at any time. So what we're going to do here is just go through two bills that are very much connected and viewed as a package that will address sentence enhancements in Oklahoma, which is a key driver of the incarceration rate in Oklahoma, as well as the Violence Prevention and Innovation Fund. So these are HB 2879 and SB 704. So House Bill 2879 and Senate Bill 704. We'll start off with House Bill 2879, which is the Violence Prevention Innovation Fund. So basically what this fund would do is establish a new revolving fund where we would reinvest savings from sentence enhancement reform, right? So if we create, a new law that would prohibit the lengthening of folks' sentences because they have prior felony convictions, we could then safely reduce the prison population, and those savings could then be reinvested into this fund that will fill funding gaps. Currently, a lot of domestic violence service providers and other folks who support survivors of violence, they're not receiving all of the funds and support that they need in order to keep their doors open, in order to serve as many survivors as necessary. We're also not investing in being smart and using evidence-based responses to crime and violence in our communities, right? Instead, more than $500 million each year is being spent to fund the prison system. And by implementing criminal justice reform, we will be able to save some of that money and invest it in evidence-based crime prevention programs in order to reduce recidivism. This fund would essentially create grant opportunities for service providers where they could request, make proposals to the granting committee, right? So they'll be able to fill out an application, talk about the operating costs that they have and those budget gaps, and hopefully receive the funds that they need to sustain themselves and grow. We'll also be able to support innovative pilot programs in Oklahoma. We can have restorative justice programs, programs that are focused on healing and alternatives to incarceration, so that folks aren't necessarily going into prisons in order to keep our community safer, right? So basically, those are the grants. And then there will also be a granting committee filled with trauma-informed health professionals, criminal justice reform experts, and other advocates, including people who are directly impacted by violence, who will be able to share and review those grant proposals and identify those programs that are needed for Oklahoma to do better, and really invest in fellow Oklahomans and not invest in mass incarceration. This Violence Prevention Innovation Fund is very unique in that it recognizes this connection between victimization and involvement in the criminal legal system, as we'll talk about later and share some statistics. People who cause harm and people who have been harmed, they're not mutually exclusive groups. We know that the vast majority of folks who are in prisons in Oklahoma and throughout the country are survivors of violence themselves. So really wanting to get at the root causes of harm in our communities so that we can create better solutions to those problems and solve them that way. Kris or Shanna, y'all want to add anything?
Jasmine, I just want to underscore, you said it perfectly. I think it was along about 2014, 2015, a researcher at OU by the name of Susan Sharp, Dr. Susan Sharp, did some research, and she uncovered exactly what Jasmine has just laid out, and that when it comes to particularly our female population of those individuals who are in prison, issues of unresolved trauma and untreated mental illness, and just the correlation of how unresolved trauma over the course of time leads to anxiety and depression. And then couple that with, issues of addiction when a person begins to self-medicate to try to get some relief from those untreated mental illness core issues that Jasmine associated. Those factors, when left untreated or not properly addressed, tend to manifest themselves in antisocial behavior over the course of time. And so a fund like this, with this kind of innovation, I think just gives the network of domestic violence providers across the state who are doing tremendous work, they're just under-resourced, the opportunity to really be effective in interrupting that cycle of what often leads a person to find themselves involved in the criminal justice system. This is really exciting.
Could I also add to that what we're doing in Oklahoma City, I know a lot of the schools because my background is in education, and they're doing that same trauma-informed work, for example, at Positive Tomorrows, which is our school in Oklahoma City for homeless children. And Susan Ogle, who is the director there, and that she has talked a lot about how the children that they're working with in maybe the public schools would be children who would be in the principal's office getting in trouble. And because they're using trauma-informed approaches in the classrooms at Positive Tomorrows, these kids are thriving. So we can see that working at the youngest levels, and we all, can remember the kiddos who maybe were constantly in trouble when we were in elementary school. And now that we know better, we're doing better. We know that maybe those children were experiencing trauma and maybe ranking high on those adverse childhood experiences scores. And so to make that correlation between what's happening in our schools and that continues throughout our development, throughout our lifetimes. And so thank you for that, Jasmine.
Yeah, exactly that. And Dr. Sharp's work too that Kris had mentioned also looked at the women's prison population and found that a large proportion of them had also experienced parental or guardian incarceration as a child. So we definitely see those connections. And I also have some statistics from Dr. Sharp's work later in the presentation. Awesome. So that feeds into the Sentence Enhancement Reform Bill. So SB 704, which I mentioned is greatly tied to HB 2879, right? So savings from the passage of SB 704 could be deposited into that Violence Prevention Innovation Fund. So what this reform will basically do is prohibit sentence enhancements for many nonviolent offenses. Oklahoma laws add years, decades, and up to life in prison because somebody has a prior felony conviction. And this is across all felonies, right? So unlike many other states where they also have sentence enhancements, it's different in Oklahoma because any felony can receive those sentence enhancements, right? So if somebody commits a nonviolent offense and then they have a nonviolent offense in their background, we're seeing folks getting up to life in prison. And those are extreme sentences. Oklahoma already has long sentences to begin with. So piling on those extra years is costing Oklahoman taxpayers a lot of money without very much to show for it, right? So we're seeing that this is most impactful. These sentence enhancements are most impactful when they're applied to nonviolent drug and property offenses. In most, they're being applied in 80% of the cases where an enhancement is allowable. So we have district attorneys seeking these sentence enhancements in most cases. And the people who are bearing the brunt of those enhancements are folks with nonviolent drug and property offenses. So as I mentioned, SB 704 would eliminate those enhancements for most nonviolent offenses. There are some notable carve-outs in SB 704. So you all might remember State Question 805 that was on the November 2020 ballot. It did not pass, but that state question would have applied to all nonviolent offenses. So it basically only excluded those offenses that are defined as violent by the legislature. SB 704 is a bit of a smaller reform in that it has notable carve-outs. So all domestic abuse felonies would still be able to have their sentence enhanced, as well as animal cruelty, offenses requiring sex offender registration, and DUI causing great bodily injury. These were all offenses that voters felt strongly about that should still receive sentence enhancements. So we were able to carve that out of this legislation. So again, the people who will be most impacted by SB 704 are those with nonviolent drug and property offenses, both in their past and their current sentences. Okay. SB 704 also addresses some felony pattern enhancements that exist in most drug statutes. So what these are is that if somebody is convicted of multiple drug offenses, they can also receive a sentence enhancement. SB 704 strikes this. We know that substance use disorders are real throughout this country. It's a whole epidemic throughout the country, and in Oklahoma, we're seeing a lot of that, right? Where folks are not getting the treatment and support that they need, as Kris has mentioned, as I have mentioned. Those feeling like experiences of trauma and violence in folks' past can lead to a substance use disorder, and we shouldn't be overly harsh and punitive when folks have behaviors that are very much tied to their trauma and efforts to cope. This reform would also be applied retroactively, as some of you may have remembered from State Question 780, which reclassified simple drug possession from a felony to a misdemeanor. That was later made retroactive with HB 1269, which led to one of the first, I guess, the historical commutation of over 400 people in Oklahoma. There have since been other large commutations since then. Oklahoma kind of set the scene there. We're trying to do the same with this. There are a number of people who are currently serving these excessively long sentences, and this bill would help provide relief to those people who are currently inside of prisons. Shanna or Kris, y'all want to add anything? Feel free to jump in. Okay, I'd take that silence as no, and we will move on. So the good part, right? So I kind of said, like, we set the table in the very beginning. Really centering around family separation and really wanting to support Oklahomans and help folks get back on their feet. A key thing of why these reforms are really needed is because Oklahoma is an outlier. Oklahoma has one of the highest imprisonment rates in the country for both men and women. For 3 decades, Oklahoma had the highest women's incarceration rate in the country. It has since gone down to the second highest thanks to recent reforms. But no matter what, like even with those reforms and a smaller prison population, Oklahoma is still well beyond the national average. As I mentioned already, Oklahoma applies these sentence enhancements to all felonies. So it is an outlier in that many other states, they are not doing that. They are reserving sentence enhancements for people with violent current or prior convictions. Research shows that these long sentences are not keeping the community safer, and it isn't giving folks a real chance at redemption. Most folks are going to leave prison, right? And they're going to return to their communities. They're going to return to their families. The longer we keep folks incarcerated, the harder it becomes for them to get on their feet and reenter society successfully. We also mentioned too that over $500 million is spent on the prison system in Oklahoma each year. This is a lot of money. With limited resources, that money should be going into investing and supporting survivors of crime and evidence crime prevention programs. We know that prisons are not keeping the community safer. These super long sentences are not showing us a cost benefit. So we should instead be investing in those programs that will do so. Crime survivors and incarcerated, I also did mention, this is an important point. So a reform like SB 704 would save taxpayers over $100 million over the next 10 years. That is a lot of money. That is a lot of money to reinvest into Oklahomans, into the community writ large. And as we mentioned as well, and I'll provide more data, crime survivors and incarcerated people are not mutually exclusive groups. Most people in prisons, especially those in women's prisons, are survivors of violence, abuse, or neglect, and many are sent to prison because of behaviors that are directly tied to experiences of trauma and their efforts to cope. Anything else to add? All right. So why now? So a lot of folks will probably ask, like, why are we doing this? We already had State Question 780. We're seeing large reductions in the prison population, right? So that is true. Oklahomans have voted for State Question 780. They are supportive of criminal justice reform, which is awesome and amazing. But even with a significant reduction in the prison population, there is still a lot of work to be done. Oklahoma's imprisonment rate is far above the national average. It is in the top incarcerating states in the country. I would also be remiss to not mention that we are in a pandemic right now. And people who are in prisons in Oklahoma and across the country are at particular risk of contracting COVID-19 and dying from it. In fact, in Oklahoma, 46 people have died in custody from likely as a result of COVID-19. So this is an urgent issue. If people are incarcerated who can safely be reintegrated into our communities, it does not make sense to keep them behind bars, right? And most people in prison, as I mentioned before, will return home. Not everyone is serving a life sentence. Not everyone is there for 30, 40 years. Some folks are there for 3 years. Some people are there for 7 years. So it doesn't make sense to further their incarceration when there are more evidence-based responses. And relatedly, survivors need holistic support to heal. Survivors who are not in prisons and survivors who are in prisons. There are very few resources. There's always demands on money, right? We need better schools. We need to fund infrastructure. But though a lot of that money is being funneled into prisons. So shifting those resources into supporting survivors, supporting folks after they leave prisons, and preventing crime to begin with is a much better investment of taxpayer dollars in Oklahoma. All right, so here are some statistics. Yay. So women's incarceration in Oklahoma, as I mentioned, Oklahoma is this outlier. For 30 years, incarcerated more women per capita than any other state. I think it's very much important to show these connections and understand the pathways to incarceration for many women in Oklahoma, the majority of which, as I mentioned, are survivors of some form of violence, abuse, or neglect. Dr. Sharp's research found these statistics in doing a survey with incarcerated women that as children, 57% experienced sexual abuse. 47% experienced physical assault, and 34% experienced both. And I'm sorry, I should have given a trigger warning before giving those statistics, but it's grave, right? 57%, 47%, and 34%. And as adults, 45% experienced at least one rape, and 66% experienced intimate partner violence within 1 year of going to prison, right? So we can only imagine how high that number is if it wasn't just the year prior to them being sent to prison. So I'm sure these experiences, as we know, as the data shows us, as the conversations that we have with incarcerated folks tells us that these experiences of trauma are leading folks into prison. And it's unaddressed, as Kris had mentioned. They're not receiving that support that they need in order to heal and to thrive. It's also important to note, too, that 2/3 of women in prison are mothers with minor children. Research has shown that majority of those children were living with their moms before their moms were sent to prison. And research has also shown that a majority of those women were the primary caregiver for their children. So when they are now in prisons, that leaves their children at home with grandparents or to fend for themselves. About 135,000 children have had an incarcerated parent or guardian in Oklahoma. This is an Oklahoma number. So that is 15% of the child population in Oklahoma has experienced some form of parental incarceration or guardian incarceration. That is a high number. That's a lot of kids with high ACEs scores, just based on just that one fact, not other factors that are also computed in that ACEs score. Women are more likely to be in prison for nonviolent offenses. Nearly 80% of women admitted to prison were convicted of nonviolent offenses in 2020. The most common of those offenses are drug and property crimes, right? So this number shows us that most women are going to prison for these low-level offenses, and these are offenses that SB 704 targets. We're also seeing that women, in comparison to men, they are 31% and 26% more likely to be in prison for these drug and property offenses. So a reform like SB 704 will have a greater impact on the women's prison population. Black and Indigenous women are overrepresented in prisons, right? It's important to recognize this intersectionality here, where folks of color are disproportionately represented, especially Black and Indigenous folks. We see this on the men's side as well. Oklahoma has the second highest Black imprisonment rate in the country. And for the women's prison population, Native American, so Indigenous women make up only 9.4% of Oklahoma state population, but make up 18% of the state's prison population. For Black women, Black folks make up 7.8% of Oklahoma state population, but Black women make up almost 16% of the women's prison population. right? So obviously addressing mass incarceration is not only a criminal justice issue, but it's also a women's rights issue and a racial justice issue. So y'all can chime in. I know I've been talking a lot. If there's anything Kris or Shanna, or if there's questions, feel free to chime in. But I know that was heavy, especially some of the statistics and data around this, right? These are big problems, as we said, requiring big solutions. And I'll just pause for a second, just in case anybody wants to chime in on that before I go into next steps in tracking bills and getting involved.
I don't have a ton more to add. That was awesome, Jasmine. I would just say, you know, the SB 704 and HB 2879 are complementary bills that are very much modeled on State Question 780 and 781. So thinking about reducing the prison population to generate savings that can then be reinvested in strategies that really help to break the cycle of incarceration or address trauma in a better way. And the retroactivity component is similar to what was passed under the leadership of Governor Stitt, to make sure that the law, that people are not serving sentences that are no longer supported by the law. So it's something that we've taken our cues from Oklahoma communities and voters, to kind of go through the process of creating better using taxpayer dollars and funding more effective solutions.
So Jasmine, if I may, I just want to also say that this is heavy. Like your presentation and just seeing these statistics, it's heartbreaking. It's infuriating. I don't really know how to articulate the emotions that I'm having right now, other than just to say that we are better than this. And it has dawned on me that over the course of time and our political zeal to be quote unquote tough on crime, we've neglected to take care of people who are victims of some pretty horrific situations, and the result has been that they find themselves caught up in this criminal justice system that also way too often sets people up to fail. I just want to say, just from a reflection standpoint, that we must see the value in moving away from a system that's almost entirely based on punishment and retribution to a system that allows us to make better use of our state's resources by investing in trauma care, in mental health services, in substance use treatment. We need to see the value in investing in education and healthcare and things that actually improve the quality of life within our state. Those are my takeaways from what I've seen so far. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for being honest and real and raw with the reality of what's happening.
Thank you. So much work to do, right? We could be doing better and we should be doing better. So moving forward, right, as Shanna had mentioned, these bills are interconnected. We should be safely reducing the prison population, which is very, it's timely and much needed, and it's urgent. You've been around folks who are inside, you get a clearer view of how urgent it is. And so in doing this work, I hope you all know that we're in the middle of a legislative session, right? And so to support these bills, we need everybody involved, everybody tuned in. So the legislative session just kicked off this Monday. We had the first day of session, and we've listed some dates here. So these bills will be going through committees, and then once they're out of the committees that they're in, and these two bills specifically are in public safety and appropriations committees. And once they go through there, hopefully, they'll get revised or like maintaining their impact. And we're working and advocating to make sure that happens. But they'll go through the motions of getting votes through various committees, and legislators will have the opportunity to vote on them. And what you can do is keep note of these dates. And you can track these bills yourselves. If you're really interested in SB 704 and HB 2879, you can go on to oklahomalegislature.gov, just plug in those bill numbers, and you'll be able to read the bill yourself, and really just see what's going on, what different versions come out, different votes. You can see how each legislator is voting on these bills, right, to hold them accountable. You can follow organizations like Kris's organization, OCJR, Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. Follow our organization. You can follow many others who are also posting their legislative agenda and details about bills they support. There are thousands of bills out there that, some of them will help to end the incarceration crisis in Oklahoma. And others won't do so well in doing that, but this is your opportunity to really stay informed and look at those bills. But we are always a resource, always happy to chat with folks, always happy to answer questions. So I'll try and be super quick for the so we can get into the Q&A. But some immediate action that you can take now as the League of Women Voters, we hope that you all consider endorsing SB 704 and HB 2879. We think it's very important for you all to voice your opinions, seeing and really wanting to elevate and support survivors, both those behind prison walls and those who are not. You can call your legislators who are on the Senate Public Safety Committee. They will be looking into and voting on these bills very soon, maybe within the next week or so. So here are all of the members, here are their phone numbers. Call them, advocate. Even if they're not in your district, you can still call. You can still make sure your voice is heard. You can let them know that you're in support of these bills and that you want them to be supportive as well. If you do not know who your legislator is, I've included some links here. Maybe we can put them in the chat or in the comments section on Facebook Live. If you go to any of those links, whether through the Oklahoma Legislature, Oklahoma Policy Institute also has a Find Your Legislator tool. You can plug in your address and find who your senator or representative is. So yeah, it's very important that you make sure that your voice is heard and that you support these much needed bills that are common sense criminal justice reform, common sense investments into survivor resources.
I'll just also add, we're happy to follow up sharing this PowerPoint and to answer any questions that you might have. I know sometimes it takes a little bit to sink in, but we would so appreciate to have the endorsement and support of the League of Women Voters. And I think your voices could be incredibly powerful, as we know that our bill is coming up for a vote in the Public Safety Committee. So I always have a lot, I think it can be scary sometimes to call legislators. It's a lot easier if you do it with each other and you can have a Zoom call bank and phone bank and just go down the list and each of you call, and we're happy to follow up with any scripts or things that could be helpful for you in that. It makes such a difference for legislators to really hear from people on the phone.
And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks you guys so much. Jasmine, thank you so much for that, for all of that great information. It's really, I think that right now, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how people are very much wanting to plug in and feel connected and feel like they can make a difference somehow. So the idea that you guys have given us so many good ways that we can plug in and do things individually from our own homes when we're stuck indoors in a pandemic. But I love too the way that you guys have just talked about, and one of the things I'm so grateful, to be involved with the League is there's a lot of times if you're not connected to some of these good organizations, you feel a little bit helpless. You want to help, but you don't know how. And there's such strength in having this connection with, for sure, for me personally, with the League. And I know a lot of folks watching are already affiliated with the League, so you guys know exactly what I mean, just the strength in having friends who are all advocating together. And it's just fun so oftentimes, so much of it is really fun, the friends coming together. We've actually done things within the League, book clubs, where we come together and we read books on these issues. There's so many good books out there and so we kind of sit together and have coffee, or we've done some rage baking. One of our book clubs, we've done some fun rage baking, and then we laugh and we have, because I appreciate what you guys are saying about how heavy this can be. And so the idea that we can kind of come together and comfort and nourish one another while advocating for these important reforms, it really allows us, I think, to have staying power as a group. I think sometimes individually you can just begin to burn out even. We've talked about things like League fatigue, for sure. Those of you guys who are involved in advocacy with Forward and Oklahomans for criminal justice reform, there's just a lot of times, you'll have these setbacks at times, and then you come back because you learn from, and there's constantly this learning curve to advocacy work. And I appreciate that you guys point all of that out. I did want to say, Jan has shared that another good bill tracking mode is Bill Track 50, a good tool to track bills. And I for sure want to open it up to any questions, any of us on the call that we might have for one another, or anyone who's watching on Facebook Live. If you want to bring up a question or a comment that you might have, something that you want to share or add that could help us with our understanding of criminal justice reform and our advocacy work.
Yeah, I want to say, like, my head is moving a million miles an hour right now after that presentation. Like, I almost teared up during that presentation. It's really very personal with me. But when State Question 805 did not pass, there was a lot of opposition to it. Because of the domestic violence clauses that were in there that were not, kind of shoveled out of it, so to speak. So, and there's a lot of good criminal justice reform bills that are being presented right now. So in that, and me wanting to support a lot of this, I think I want to ask maybe, what types of opposition do you guys see other legislators or some other Oklahomans who may not actually be directly impacted from the prison system, as I have been in my personal life? What would you say to them, or also, like, double question, what do you see them bringing as an opposition, and how do we have a conversation with them about trying to make them understand why the numbers need to come down, why the prison numbers need to come down?
So, Jackie, if I could maybe take the first crack at that and response, and let me just start with a premise, and I know I'm saying some very basic things here, but Oklahoma has a balanced budget amendment in our state constitution, and what that means is that the legislature cannot appropriate more money than it takes in a given fiscal year. So let me just start there and say, to put that in real terms, the more money we spend on mass incarceration, the less money we have to spend on education. The more money we spend on mass incarceration, the less money we have to spend on health care, infrastructure, services for kiddos in at-risk situations, or anything else that we may feel like is an important critical service of government. So that's one thing. We can do better from a financial standpoint just by implementing these policies. We could do so much better. Then beyond that, there's this issue of strengthening families. Jackie, I'm so sorry. If I were close to you and it wasn't COVID, I would be giving you a great big bear hug right now. it's an issue of strengthening families and making sure that we are helping and investing in fellow Oklahomans so that they can all reach, so that we all can reach our full potential together. That's what this is about. Those who are opposed to change and try to maintain the status quo are those individuals who either are part of the system and they don't feel like that if the system can change because it could affect the job that they do. And change is hard for everyone, but there's this natural opposition from prosecutors in the state of Oklahoma who often are trained and find themselves in a culture that perpetuates punishment as the only solution to a person who stumbles and finds themselves involved in the criminal justice system. So we have to break out of that, and we have to understand that when we can use research and data and facts, really, we're talking about facts, to base our decisions and get away from this mindset of fear and hyperbole and emotion and anecdotes and directing our policies. We can do so much better. I think when we change that paradigm, this issue becomes a no-brainer. And so ultimately, we have to understand that there will be opposition, some very viable, politically powerful opposition of those who have been trained in thinking that punishment is the best or only solution for everything. And I just want to say, we are talking about non-violent offenses. We're not talking about people who create acts of violence against another person. That has all been taken out of this policy reform. And so we've tried to be responsive. We've addressed every voiced concern that was made known during State Question 805, and we're coming back with really what is a compromised version to meet people where they're at in Oklahoma as a way to move forward. And I think we just have to be diligent and perseverance and do this together. Diligent and persevering and do this together.
Thank you,
Kris. I love the way that you say that. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to add that I think we have the data and the research on our side when it comes to pushing for these reforms, and we will continue to make our case to state legislators who might be skeptical or who are just learning about the issue. And I think those are great conversations to have. But I do also want to just put it out there for the league that I think it's really important for our state leaders to understand what people actually experience when it comes to long sentences or incarceration, or what it means, like I said, to have a family member incarcerated. And so I think those stories are incredibly powerful. I was shocked, when we were working on the State Question 805 campaign, to hear about some of the sentences that people face in Oklahoma. Like 15 years for shoplifting, or decades long sentences for writing a bad check. These are things that I think would shock and anger most Oklahomans, because we all know that we are a razor's edge from being on the other side of things, if our circumstances change for some reason. And so, Jackie, I think it would be so powerful for people to hear from you about your experience, not to put you on the spot at all, but, I think as you all, as members, are thinking about ways to leverage your voices, telling your stories about your experiences is really powerful.
Definitely. Thank you. And thank you for that, Kris. When we do finally make our meeting in person, I'll get that hug from you. But one more thing that I'm going to say too, I think this will be kind of directed at Jasmine. We had spoke about how criminal justice reform relates to the Department of Human Services and Child Protective Services. Can you kind of touch on that? Because we didn't speak about that yet.
Yeah, sure. So what Jackie is referring to is in my past life, I wrote a report about mothers in Oklahoma jails, and family separation. But obviously this doesn't just impact folks who are in jails and awaiting trial. So some of the numbers that I mentioned, we have in Oklahoma just a lot of children who are impacted by parental incarceration. And when moms are incarcerated in particular, these families are separated. A lot of times, because somebody has been arrested, the DHS can be deployed and involved in someone's case. People can lose their parental rights. So not only temporarily, but also permanently. So we have families that are being torn apart, not just for this period of jail or incarceration, but for life, where you're making a parent into a legal stranger because of their proximity to the criminal legal system. So it is very important to recognize how family separation is operating, how we're tearing families apart, how we're not supporting families, we're locking them up, we're not giving them the funding and resources, we're criminalizing poverty, the fact that people can't afford food, and then we call that neglect, the fact that they can't afford lights in their house, and then we're calling that neglect, and then incarcerating them because of it. So I think it's really important for the league and for everyone else, right? Like these reforms that we're talking about, these are meaningful, these will impact a lot of folks, but this is not the end all be all, right? This isn't the end of our investment and Kris's investment and so many others' investment in transforming the system that exists in Oklahoma. We have families that are fractured, and we can be reunifying them. We can be keeping them whole through alternatives to incarceration by making sure that they can reunify, having plans of reunification that are not criminalizing people, that are not surveilling people, that are not punishing people because they are poor, because they are Black, because they are Indigenous, because they have a substance use disorder. So there are a lot of connections between not only this criminal legal system and how punitive it is, but also how other state agencies are punitive as well, in tearing families apart.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And then the last thing, and if Shanna can take this, and she didn't get a question yet, I think, what about mental health related to criminal justice and sending people to prison instead of having more facilities available?
Yeah, I think I think both Jasmine and Kris touched on this a little bit, but for us, it's about where you put limited resources. Oklahoma is feeling effects of the pandemic now, economic consequences that we know are going to carry on. So the budget's not getting any bigger. We have a finite amount of resources to spend to help bolster communities and ensure that they are thriving and healthy. And so it's a matter of priorities. It's, do you want to invest those limited dollars in prisons, or do you want to put them into mental health treatment, substance use treatment, and recovery from trauma? And for us, we feel that the research shows, and other states have also shown, that those are good investments to make. I know Oklahoma is a fiscally conservative state, and so it just makes so much sense for the state to be allocating those resources to solutions that address people's needs and can really help to increase public safety.
Jackie, can I just add, Stephanie? I know that we're right up against time. I just want to underscore again the influence of the League of Women Voters on issues like this. I can't tell you how powerful the interaction, the involvement from this organization, given your reputation, given who is comprised of who comprises League of Women Voters. As a former legislator, if I got 5-10 phone calls on a given issue, it felt like the whole world was interested in that. Think about what would happen if we had 30-40 phone calls going into this committee to these committee members prior to the vote, they would think, my goodness, there is legitimate support for these issues. And the reality is there is legitimate support for these issues. We just need to take that, make that effort, take that step to make those calls and to be engaged. And so I just want to say thank you again for this conversation. And my final word would be this: all of us need all of us to succeed. There is no such thing as a spare Oklahoman. We cannot afford to give up on anyone. And we have to be about investing in those services that Shanna just underscored so that we could collectively improve the quality of life throughout our state.
Kris, thank you so much. I want to give Jackie the final word tonight. And before I do that too, I want to say thank you, Shanna, Jasmine, Shay, Jan, Kris. I also want to point out that we did have one, I think a beautiful thing that came from this conversation tonight in just an hour. We heard from folks on Facebook saying, we really would like to have ongoing conversations. So please know that this isn't just a one-time and done. We are going to continue as we advocate for criminal justice reform. We'll continue having conversations because I understand that there are still confusing issues and some questions that folks have because these are difficult conversations. So the idea that we have lots of good conversations to be had during this next year. And thank you guys all for the work that you all do. And Jackie, for you, the final word.
Thank you, Stephanie. So yeah, there's a couple more bills that are present, and I'm just going to read a synopsis of them. So House Bill 2431, it says, would direct the state attorney general's office to create and maintain a database of law enforcement officers who have been fired or resigned prior to facing disciplinary action. And then House Bill 2623, and it would allow formerly incarcerated Oklahomans to vote as soon as they are released from prison. And it would also allow Oklahomans serving a felony probation sentence to vote. And then House Bill 1903 would make more prisoners eligible for medical parole, particularly if the governor has declared a catastrophic health emergency. And then the last one, Senate Bill 456, would increase the number of state inmates eligible for early release under the Department of Corrections GPS's monitoring system. And I'm reading that from an article on Oklahoma Watch, and it is titled 5 Criminal Justice and Corrections Bills to Watch This Season. So look on their website for that. And yeah, just thank everybody for coming. If there is anyone who is interested in further conversation, reach out to the office. The phone number here is 405-286-9909. And the email to the office is office@lwvok.org. And we just thank everyone who came and listened. And again, thank you so much, Shanna. Thank you much, Kris, Jasmine. Jan, you know, I love you. That's my boss. She's the best boss in the world. And thank you to Shay too. And definitely to you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much. And Jackie, I owe you a text. Bye, everybody.